If you're a screenshot person, you could take a screenshot here. But the idea is you're going to say to your students, if I change one thing about this scenario, what will happen? If this is your first Quick Bite, welcome. Quick Bites are quick, actionable strategies that we share that we are confident you can go and apply this afternoon if you're teaching later today. This one might take a tiny bit more prep time, but not too much. And it's kind of a meta change one thing strategy, which is change one thing problems. These ideas are inspired by the decades-long career of Professor Paul Heidemann, who recently retired from William and Mary. He presented at last year's Teaching and Learning Symposium about his lessons learned over the course of his career, framed around the idea of making small changes to his teaching, just one small thing at a time, which, added up over 30 plus years, turned into a very successful career as a teacher. All right. So, change one thing problems came out of Professor Heidemann's desire to help push his students out of a place of memorizing biology content or science content and into a place of applying that content and being critical thinkers. Um, he was finding that telling them to, just think about it didn't really work, and he needed something that would move from that more passive orientation of let me sit and get the notes and then make sure I can regurgitate them on the test into something where they could really grapple with the key underlying concepts in his courses. And what he found with change one thing problems is that it really works in any content area in a variety of ways, and that once he modeled the strategy for his students and taught them how to do that themselves, it then became a tool that they could use independently to study and prepare better for his exams. He actually saw the averages on his exams dramatically increase as he started using this strategy. And at first thought, oh man, am I doing something wrong? Do I need to make the exams harder? But it's really just because his students became better at, again, the worthy struggle of learning, and we're better prepared to respond to difficult exam questions. It's really easy. If you're a screenshot person, you could take a screenshot here. But the idea is you're going to say to your students, if I change one thing about this scenario, what will happen? Now, you're not going to say one thing. You're going to fill in the blank of one thing with the variable that you would like them to manipulate or change. Let's take a look at some examples. We could change something by taking something out of the system. We could make one variable bigger or smaller. We could increase or decrease the importance of some factor in the problem that we're looking at. We could change up the timing of something. We could change the surrounding context in which events happen or a scientific process unfolds. Or we could go back to the very beginning of the process and change the inputs. I want to show you some content specific examples. I'm going to give you the disclaimer that I am not, in fact, fluent in every content area that is taught at William and Mary. So I did ask ChatGPT for some assistance with this next slide. I said, I would like some content specific examples of open-ended questions at the upper levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And then I tweaked them a little bit and edited them to be more relevant to some different disciplines that I'm not as familiar with. So here is an example that I think could apply to anyone who is using case studies for teaching. We're often looking at a case, we're asking students to discuss it. In the change one thing scenario, what we might do is say, let's look at this case through the lens of a different leadership style. For example, how might the outcomes have been different if this leader was behaving in a different way? Biology. What might we expect to see if we're looking at this ecosystem and a new apex predator is reintroduced? History. Let's develop a timeline for how these events would have unfolded differently if Columbus's ships had landed at their intended destination. Literature. This one is mine. This is from my favorite novel. What might have happened if Edward had told Jane about his secret wife in the attic from the very beginning? Sorry, spoiler alert if you haven't read Jane Eyre. Math. This is a really basic one. So even though ChatGPT did help me with this, I was able to follow the logic here. We do this all the time. So let's consider a function. What happens to the graph of the function if we increase the value of A and keep B and C constant? If you're a screenshot person, if you find this slide compelling, I will share them after with you in a digital format. But if anything strikes a chord here, I'll pause for a moment for you to grab that. All right, when should you use change one thing problems? After you have taught your students how to use them, after you've introduced the concept to them and modeled it a little bit in class, then you can encourage them to use this as a study strategy, either individually or in groups. So Professor Heidemann talks about prompting his students to develop several change one thing problems and then to pair up in class and quiz each other. So they swap problems and they say, okay, I'm going to quiz you. You know, what happens if we change this? Um, Again, in class, to prompt discussion, to prompt more engaged conversations, and really encouraging students to grapple with learning rather than to just, again, passively consume. And then on assessments, these are great. I hesitate to say chat GPT proof things, but when you're asking students to take the full volume of what you've talked about and learned in class, the readings, the discussions, the examples, and apply them to a novel scenario where some variable changes in an unexpected way, they really, it's going to show whether they deeply understand the content, the processes, and the underlying thinking versus having a more superficial, memorized understanding. A couple of kind of caveats to keep in mind when you start to apply change one thing problems to your teaching. One thing is it's you need to give your students some grace. Um, the language that Professor Heidemann uses when he talks about this is based on what I expect you to know at this point in the semester. So a student might actually give an incomplete or inaccurate answer, but if what they're saying in these change one thing responses is accurate based on what you might expect them to know at that point in the semester, they should still get full credit for that. The real point here is, can they think critically? Can they defend their example or their answers and provide supporting examples from other areas of the content that you would expect them to know? So you do want to give them full credit for the most part, even if there might be some technical details missing. You really want to, when you're using this particular strategy, focus on looking at how they're thinking, their logical processes, and again, what you would expect them to know. It doesn't mean that you just say 100, this is perfect, moving on. It means that you provide some feedback and you tell them, hey, this is technically inaccurate, but we haven't gotten to it yet. So, put a pin in this mentally because we're going to come back to this after the midterm. And otherwise, your logic is sound. And this really gets at that idea that I think most instructors I engage with are looking for, is that they're not necessarily trying to prepare students to pass their class. They're not trying to prepare them to get a good grade on the exam. They're trying to prepare them to be the kinds of critical thinkers who can be successful in the field after the class is over. So I believe it was Professor McHenry who said, I'm not interested in them learning about supply and demand. I'm interested in them learning how to think like an economist. That's what these problems get at. Why does it work? Because when I'm sitting here passively consuming your beautiful lecture, the slides, the visual aids that you've given me, the examples you're going through, I'm nodding along. I think that I understand. I'm a William and Mary student and I worked really hard to get here. And I really think that I understand what you're sharing. But as soon as I have to confront a change in scenario, that's tested. That my learning, the depth of my understanding, and my ability to think critically about the content is really tested. So when you test students in that way, when you invite them to think about, well, what are the processes here? What happens if we change something up, like the context, like the timing? They are forced to then grapple with learning and to make it more active. And then to hopefully, identify some gaps in their understanding before they get to a high stakes exam. As with any strategy, when you are changing up your teaching, especially if any of you are bold enough to change up your teaching on December 4th, tell your students why you are doing that. Be transparent with them, like, hey, I just went to this session from STLI and it gave me an idea. I want to try something out today and see how you all like it and how I like it. And let's see if this could be a helpful tool as we prepare for final exams. Do not try this change one thing strategy on your final exam if you have never practiced it in class, please. Um, Learning happens during that struggle. And so when we invite students to struggle with their learning in a different way, in a supported environment, and preferably with lots of low stakes practice in class before it shows up on the exam, we know that it solidifies what they've learned. It helps them draw stronger connections between concepts and makes their learning more durable. All right, here's the recap. If you're going to, take a screenshot or a picture, this is the slide to do it. Change one thing problems. Here's what we say. Based on what I expected you to know at this point in the semester, if I change one thing about this scenario, what will happen? And again, that one thing could be timing, context, importance, scale, lots of different variables that you could change up when you're asking students to consider their learning from a different lens. Okay, we're already coming to the end. I would like to know how confident you feel about using this change one thing strategy to improve your students' critical thinking skills. A lot of you were already in the launch pad, so all right. Feeling very confident about it. Nice. That will stay up if you want to continue responding. I'm just going to jump to the next slide. Poll Everywhere is being so picky lately about slides. I'll let you know that if you want to spend some more time with STLI, if you've been just anxiously awaiting the winter break so that you can do some more professional learning, we're always here for you at academy.wm.edu. If you're interested specifically in the Change One Thing podcast, you can find us on YouTube or SoundCloud, and you can hear straight from Professor Heidemann about these wonderful strategies. We are starting to make plans for our season 2, which will feature some other personalities across campus. So if you have an example that you feel fits well within this Change One Thing framework of like, hey, I did this one little tweak in my class and it made a big difference for my learners, we want to hear from you, especially if you're willing to be on the podcast with me and have a quick conversation. And then, of course, we want you to save the date, January 10th. It's the very end of the planned pause in January, and we are totally leaning in to the pause part of it. We are going to have a very zen atmosphere that day, but we're going to help you get ready to have the most relaxing spring semester of your life. We'll see. I don't know. Don't hold me accountable for that on the reviews. But I know that from talking with many of you, it is helpful to do some pre-planning to before the semester gets rolling to kind of have everything in order. So we encourage you to save that date on your calendar because we'll have some useful sessions that will be very action-oriented, hands-on workshops to get things ready for the spring. All right, I'll stay on for a minute if there are any questions. Otherwise, thank you all so much for coming. Always lovely to shine a light on Professor Heidemann's wisdom in this way.